particular hui was set up by New Zealanders for a Democratic Economy, NZDE, who have been behind the other two as well, and co-chair of NZDE, Harry Robson, is actually in Wellington this evening, so is unable to be here, but that's all right. I will take care of proceedings. Can you hear down the back okay? All good? Thank you. First up this evening, we have Dick Werry, who will be speaking to us. By way of introduction, Dick has recently edited a book, Privatisation and Plunder, and he will talk a little bit about being able to access that book. It is for purchase, but it talks a lot about the things that we have been talking about, and that is how those assets, that infrastructure, all of those resources that were developed with taxpayers' money and ratepayers' money is at threat of being privatised. How it has been privatised in the past, and this amounts to no more than plunder of resources that belong to the people of New Zealand. And so we feel very privileged to have Dick with us tonight to talk to us about his book and these topics, which are of such great importance, particularly at this time with a government that seems hell-bent on moving forward with a neoliberal agenda, which is now very much out of date if it was ever in vogue. So I'd like you to put a big hand together for Mr. Dick Werry.
Thank you very much. Is that right? Do I have to do anything with this? Can you hear me? Yes. Oh, good. Thank you very much. I won't speak for terribly long because the speakers that are following me are far better at this business than I am, and I would prefer you to spend more time with them than with me. We have published the book Privatisation and Plunder, which is actually a publication of the New Zealand Fabian Society. There are copies at the back, which we would dearly like you to purchase. It's only $30, which is quite cheap. And I must say that in its first week of issuance, it was the top non-fiction selling book in the country. We had an initial run of 1,000 books, which have all been sold, and we're doing another, and we've had orders for more than 1,000 for the second run. Now that mightn't sound very much, but for a book of this type, it's most unusual, especially one that has a number of contributors such as it has. So, excuse me. The book's called Privatisation and Plunder, Neoliberalism, Its Causes, Costs and Alternatives. It is about the fight to retain the public domain, the public realm, democratic agency and civic renewal, which is the title of tonight's talk. The last time I visited Christchurch was when Council was contemplating the sale of the electricity network. That was, I think it was about, I don't know, Marty, it was about 2015, I think, wasn't it? That the Christchurch City Council had put the prospective sale of its electricity network into the 10-year plan. And of course, a whole lot of people were very hostile about that. We had written, Peter Harris and I and my friend Jim Turner had written a paper which compared the electricity network in Wellington, which had been privatised, and we compared that with the regional council's bulk water network. They both had the same boundaries. The Wellington electricity network was fully privatised in about 1995, and our calculation was based on the numbers from 1990 through to 2010. So it's a sort of a 20-year snapshot which captured the 15 years of privatisation of the network. The electricity network increased in value by 400% over that time. Its cost of running the operation and its profit line increased by 400% over that period. The regional council's bulk water network, which had exactly the same boundary, increased by 17% over that 20-year period, which is actually half the rate of inflation. Anyway, we spoke to quite a big gathering of people, and I think the paper actually went to the council, and they subsequently withdrew the prospective sale from the 10-year plan. So I guess that was something of a victory. And it's astonishing how often the politicians frequently talk about Christchurch as the, you know, as a Soviet that where all its assets need to be sold. And Christchurch City is constantly being urged to sell all its assets, but fortunately it has ignored all that. As a matter of interest, the local electricity networks, when they were publicly owned, used to contribute 14% to household electricity costs. Since they have been privatised or corporatised, and admittedly some of like or Christchurch is publicly owned, but since the time that they were separated out as separate corporations, they now constitute something like 48% of your power bill. Of course, previously it was strictly price control. They were not allowed to make a profit, and if they ever did, inspectors from the Internal Affairs would come down and chase it out. And the interesting thing is, for most of our history, the New Zealand Electricity Department has produced the cheapest electricity in the world. Most of that period, because the first power stations I think were built in the early 1900s, and right from day one they were publicly owned. When we presented our we presented our paper to the Wellington Fabian Society, and they were absolutely enraged. Where the cheapest power in the world was all going to be privatised. Why had our government privatised so much of our public assets in banking, insurance, communications, even though they had all performed reasonably well? We had no answer, hence we started working on this book. We wanted to find an answer to why all these huge and ruptural transformations took place. What was done? Now, I want to go on a little bit of a diversion and discuss how we might think about why all this has happened. I mean, it's been ruptural, it's been ginormous, and it's been outrageous. A very great man once said that all hitherto known history is the history of class struggle, which most of you will recognise as the opening lines of the Communist Manifesto. This sounds at best dogmatic and polemical, of course. It's a throwaway line but the need to ask what the opposite of that idea is. That is to say, the material determination of history, as opposed what the opposite of that is that all hitherto known history is the self-movement of an idea. And there are only two possible options. One provides the prospect of a sensible and material analysis where you can actually find out what's going on, and the other simply does not. I'll elaborate this a bit further. In his 18th Brumaire of Napoleon Bonaparte, Marx argued that the French Revolution was caused by the titanic struggle between the royal aristocracy, who needed bonded labour to survive, and the rising bourgeoisie, who needed free labour for their conditions of existence. There could be no compromise, and the fight culminated in the French Revolution, and the Cromwellian period in Britain was very much the same. There was no point of commonality at all. They had to fight it all to the death. In a way, but the fight of the French Revolution was expressed in slogans: liberty, fraternity, and equality, all of which had absolutely nothing to do with what's going on underneath. And there's a certain parallel with the French Revolution when we try to explain the rise of neoliberalism, because no one knows what's going on. We hear these weird slogans coming out of these people from the ACT Party. The global financial power of capital has grown surreptitiously to an enormous level. The numbers are staggering. BlackRock, for example, manages $13 trillion in assets. 13 trillion. That's half the US GDP and 15% of the world's GDP. It must be at least, well, how many times? I don't know. You divide that out as many, many tens of times, 20, 30, 40 times the size of the New Zealand government in just one corporation, asset-owning corporation. It seems to me that the weight of this capital is such that it is forced to move against the will of the social democratic state. And that's basically what's happened. That's been the agenda. In his polemical work on imperialism, Lenin said that this new level of capital accumulation is a process of natural history. And there's just simply no way we can go back to the way we were. I know that within the Labour Party there was a call for Grant Robinson at one of the conferences to purchase the Westpac Bank. He said, look, I'm sorry, I haven't got to spare a couple of $1 trillion to do it. And there have been various remits saying, let's get back, let's renationalise our electricity. The money that required to do that is just so ginormous, and the consequences of it are huge. And I remember once making a submission on a peculiar piece of legislation to the Select Committee on what was then called the Taxation Base Erosion Profit Shifting Bill. Don't need to worry about the title. I don't think anybody understood it. But what it was about the fact that large corporations lent money to their subsidiary in New Zealand and adjusted their profit line through the interest rates of the loan from the parent to the subsidiary. And that had happened hugely with Wellington Electricity, which is Cheung Kong Holdings, which is partly state-owned in the sense that it's half owned by the Shanghai City Council. I don't know if that's helpful at all, but it's just the wrong country that owns it. But we made submissions on this piece of legislation because they purchased Wellington Electricity with two loan lots. They paid $800 million for it. One loan was at 8.75%, and the other one was 5.75%. And when you added the two up on their loan, it roughly got very close to the $100 million in profits that they were making, literally from day one. This proposed legislation was to say that that's all very well, but you must charge an interest rate between the parent and the subsidiary that relates to their credit rating. And in the case of Wellington Electricity, it meant they'd have to pay a little bit of tax, but it wasn't all that. Now, I was an old friend of mine, Bill Sheet, who was a Tory from way back, and he was really angry and started banging the table and said, look, they shouldn't be getting anything like this concession at all. And Judith Collins came up to him and said, look, I'm sorry, Bill, if we did what you weren't, I just totally agree with you. Of course we should be taking a much stronger view than this. She said, but if we do what you say, the Federal Reserve will bankrupt New Zealand within a fortnight. And unfortunately, what you said was actually true. But nonetheless, what I want to go on to is that the justification for wrenching these assets from the people with privatisation was all about individual freedom, prosperity, and the liberation of people from the draconian powers of the state. I think I sound a bit like Rodney Hyde. In his piece, Rentier Capitalism, Guy Standing makes it clear that the freedoms referred to by the neoliberal agenda have absolutely nothing to do with individual liberty and everything to do with the freedom of capital. In the same way, the French Revolution had nothing to do with liberty and everything to do with the exploitation of free labour. This is why we need to undertake an intensive theoretical analysis of our new material conditions of existence. That's where we need to start. In the book, Bill Rosenberg discusses privatisation and rising inequality. This will make you angry. Brett Christopher's contribution, and he's a professor of economics at Uppsala University in Sweden, and he talks about how asset management rules our lives and what we can do about it. He insists that the public sector must reclaim a much stronger role in the managing essential services. I mean, Macquarie's Bank, there was a spokesperson, I read somewhere that a spokesperson from the bank had said that we affect the lives of 2 billion people and they don't even know about it. Max Harris and Jacqueline Paul have contributed the proposal to form a Ministry of Green Works, which is designed to address the housing shortage using our own forces basically for public housing. Also to train a workforce that could do that sort of to go some way towards recovering the prospect of a new Ministry of Works. Now that's actually sort of quite a feasible thing, and it's possible that this proposal to form a new Green Ministry of Works might become a coalition agreement between Labor and the Greens after the November election next year. Hopefully that will happen because, look, state housing construction stopped in 1900. It just stopped. It flatlined. It was really actually quite buoyant until then. They just didn't. And the funny thing is, within the housing area, the total value of the state housing New Zealand portfolio is $18 billion. The annual rent roll is $1.8 billion, which is a 10% return, which I think most private landlords would say that's bloody good, and they unfortunately, Treasury absolutely loathes and despises Housing New Zealand and says, oh no, the assets are worth 80 billion and the return is less than 1.5%, and therefore it's a waste of time and the government should be getting out of the business. But when you see that there is actually a prospect of making a profit from growing the housing portfolio for Housing New Zealand, why on earth can't they do it? Simply because they're absolutely a fixation on doing things by way of the market. The Max Rash book advocates decision-making through citizens' assemblies, which have proved so successful in Ireland on the abortion question and dealing with the question of Uber's right to exist in Taiwan. These were treated to citizens' assemblies, and good answers arrived from them. One was held recently, very successful in Porirua, organised by Helmut Modlink, and they came out with some very, very important understandings of the treaty and how we should be responding to it. And then we have another contribution from Professor Bill Mitchell of Newcastle University in Australia, who advances the prospect of modern monetary theory. Now, I can't fully understand the article in the book. I'm told by economists that it's very clear, and I know that Craig and Bill will both understand it readily. So it does need a huge amount of elaboration. But that is just simply to say that if a country has sovereign control over its own currency, there's nothing to stop it from spending as much as it likes, provided the economy is able to manage that increase in funding. If it can't manage it, then it will be inflationary. Japan, for instance, which has no unemployment, no housing no homeless people, has a jet to GDP ratio, I think, of something like 300%. But it's all internal money, so apparently it doesn't matter. So I think I've gone on far enough, but I'll conclude with the need. We have a huge need for a comprehensive industrial policy. And there is an example in the past where this has happened. In the 1960s, we had a Conservative government. I think you'll all remember Keith Holyoake. Surprisingly, New Zealand was facing a huge amount of challenges then. New Zealand, the United Kingdom was about to join the European community. We had enormous energy price increases. Petrol prices escalated enormously, and the wool prices collapsed. In the mid-60s, the wool prices completely collapsed. And it meant that the New Zealand government, and in this case, had to develop a very, very comprehensive industrial policy. So Holyoake, at the time, formed the Rural Bank, the Development Finance Corporation, the Development Finance Corporation. We also built the Marsden Point oil refinery, and as an add-on, started the process of getting ACC and the domestic purposes benefit, which you had implemented. So these sorts of things can be done, and anyway. But I really need to emphasise that what we do need is a very, very intensive theoretical elaboration of what's actually going on in the world and what we might do to address it. So, thank you very much. All done.
Thank you, Dick. That was fantastic. Another round of applause for Dick Werry. A nice succinct way of presenting how neoliberalism was the bourgeoisie's revolution, basically, to get back what they had lost. Yeah. And we're still reeling from the consequences of that. A lot of fantastic data and facts to back up these arguments in the book. So check it out. Privatisation and plunder. Thank you, Dick. Really appreciate that, your contribution. And also you mentioned someone else will be speaking to us later this evening. But before we get to that, our next speaker is Mr. Mark or Lord Mark Wilson, who's speaking to us he's had a lot to do with what's happening down at the port in Littleton and its consequent knock-on effects. And we've heard a little bit about that in the news quite recently with the increase in container prices and so on because of actions that the port company is taking in relation to workers. But Mark's going to talk to us some more about that. Mark is heavily involved with RMTU, and so he knows firsthand what's going on. So I hand the time over to Mark Wilson.
Yeah, hi everyone. Actually, just before I start, I'd like to say thank you to NZDE for organising this. RMTU's had a bit to do with NZDE, and also thank NZDE and COA for quite a successful. Can you phone off? Quite a successful council campaign to inform the Republic of Christchurch on what is actually good for our people, our future, and just the Christchurch city as a whole. So as Nathan alluded to, I'll focus a little bit more on almost really what sort of happens or what has happened after a very I don't want to say neoliberal, but a very unabashedly confident CCHL board who were empowered by a Northington report that really encouraged asset sales, and so we have some management in place now who were put in place during that time, and things have changed. So, so as Nathan mentioned, I'm from the RMTU. I'm the branch secretary there. I've been branch secretary for 3 years. I thought I might just run through a high-level sort of sequence of events since I took over from Heine Binnick, that role. So Heine basically called me up when I was unloading a trailer full of cement or concrete, and he got me at a very vulnerable moment, and I said yes to be the branch secretary. I didn't have any idea what was in store for me for these 3 years that I've gone through. But when I took over RMTU, or running the union, at LPC, the work culture was actually improving. It was on the back of the Maria Dew report, and also a take report, like an investigative committee. The Transport Authority. I can't even remember. Okay, Transport. Yep. Yeah. Just any questions, ask Marnie. The take report, and that was to do with Don Grant, a work colleague, passing away on a coal vessel. The take report and the Northington report had a whole bunch of recommendations. A lot of them aligned with something that we actually had implemented and had agreed to. It was called HPHE, High Performance, High Engagement. Now, HPHE was something that Roger Gray brought in when he came over from, he actually came from Australia. He came via Air New Zealand, and then he took over at LPC, implemented HPHE. All the unions signed up to it, apart from the Guild, the Guild of the Merchant Services Guild, and they essentially operate tugs and are the pilots that go out and bring the vessels in, stop them crashing in Diamond Harbour. They were also going to sign up with HPHE as well. Just needed a bit more time to work out a few things there. However, that was the setting. I took over the RMTU, running the union, and what I didn't really recognise at the time was that bargaining was around the corner, and there were also some very dark clouds on the horizon. Early 2022, we started bargaining for some of our various collectives. The major one is our main collective, dealing with the container terminal operations, covers about 180 workers or so, and MUNS is about the same, maybe a little bit larger. They also negotiate at the same time as well. So our main collective took 6 months to negotiate. That wasn't necessarily indicative of fractious negotiations. It was a very thorough negotiation, and also a complex negotiation with another union on site and negotiating at the same time. Complexity. That's what Littleton Port actually is sometimes. So towards the middle of 2022, before we'd signed our collective, we became aware that the CCHL, the overarching governance of our public infrastructure, public assets, was pushing the Northington report, advising council to effectively sell assets or divest. The report, unfortunately, really it included a whole bunch of stuff that was out of its brief, out of its scope. and quite unfortunately, when you label the workforce of a port inflexible, lazy, overpaid, didn't really appreciate it. But that's really what was in it, amongst a whole. And also remind them of what CCHL stated in their last AGM, which is that they expect partnership to be a method of operation. They expect the workforce to combine with management and actually make a change. So we will again ask him if he is prepared to change the course and come back to working with the unions and get the workforce back on site. So watch this space. That's it from me. Have a good night.
Thanks, Mark. You're a man who quite literally is tearing your hair out. It's gone. It's gone. Where's it gone? Grubby Graham's got it. All right. Thank you so much for explaining some of the key details that are really going on down at the port. That, you know, we're seeing some of the results in the news, but good to have a first-hand eyewitness to these events speaking to us about what's really happening. Another round of applause for Mark Wilson. The question we have to ask is, why is it so similar? Why are they singing from the same song sheet? And where does this all go? And who else might be involved? Good questions. Watch that space too. And also whether, you know, those of us who pay rates, either through rent or directly pay rates, funding expansions, etc., reclamations, etc., which might benefit other organisations. Yep, but there's a lot that could be said about that. So thank you very much, Mark. Now we're going to take a 10-minute break. Well, welcome back, everybody. That's I know 10 minutes flies when you're having fun, chatting to friends. Yep. Great ideas. But one thing that we were just talking about in the break, following on from what Mark said, is New Zealand's Democratic Economy, NZDE, been talking about something called Civic, which is Christchurch Public Infrastructure Commission. And it's about using workers and democratically elected representatives along with experts to actually take back power over publicly owned infrastructure, so that the kinds of situations that we're now seeing at Littleton can be avoided. So yes, we look forward to further discussions around that. Now, I hope you've got yourselves toileted and watered and you're ready for the next phase, because we've got some very interesting speakers coming up. Next up, all the way from Wellington, we have Bill Rosenberg, who has been an economist for the CTU, and as you heard earlier, was a contributor to privatisation and plunder as well. So without any further ado, we hand the time over to our expert, Bill Rosenberg.
Okay, well, thank you very much to NZDE for inviting me to speak this evening. As many of you here will know, looking at the grey hairs around the room, I was born in Otahi, Christchurch, and lived here for my first 59 years, so I know the regular battles over the ownership of the city's resources well. Many of you also remember, and I've heard this repeated, that in the 1990s the city took the high ground in the face of insinuations by the neoliberal business roundtable that it was a communist state. The People's Republic of Christchurch, for being one of a minority of local governments which held on to its assets in the face of the national onslaught at both central and local level for the privatisation of anything that could make money for the private sector. Under Mayor Vicky Buck, it adopted the title of People's Republic of Christchurch with pride and hung on to many of its assets to the benefit of future citizens of the city, such as you. And it resulted in lower rates and many other benefits. Nonetheless, many important services, including bus services and waste collection, were put out to contract. In the 2000s, we successfully fought against the threat of the sale of the Port of Lyttelton. Unfortunately, history doesn't just rhyme, it does repeat. And so congratulations for seeing the latest threats off. But as Mark has just shown, that doesn't solve all problems. There's more to be done. And now we're seeing the potential for yet more asset sales in the wake of the huge reorganisation of local government that the central government recently announced. And maybe Craig will be talking about that a bit? I don't know. No, okay, right. Well, anyway, bear that in mind. This evening, I don't want to relive those old campaigns. Instead, I want to talk about why a local government might want to hold on to its assets in order to develop its own economy, society and environment. Publicly owned and controlled assets can play a vital role in this. New Zealand faces some stark choices. If we carry on with the current structure of our economy, too many jobs will be low paid, people will continue to leave for Australia and further afield, we'll be unable to staff our health and education systems at the levels we need for quality public services. Skills shortages will plague private sector industries. As the population ages, these problems become increasingly apparent, not inherently because the government cannot afford to pay for New Zealand's superannuation and the health needs of our older population, but because we're not producing the resources to both retain a skilled workforce and meet those needs. And politicians lack the will to redistribute the resources as they are needed. The economy in our society would be less able to respond to and recover from the shocks that hit the country, ranging from pandemics and earthquakes to economic crises, climate change and wars. It will be more difficult to respond positively to rapid technological change, such as artificial intelligence. This is not only a national problem, but a regional one. Different regions will experience the impacts in different ways. All are anxious to maintain their populations and the attractiveness of their place as a place to live, to work and to do business. Christchurch is no exception and recognises it. Historically, like most regions, Christchurch has engaged in economic development activities to push against these trends. The Christchurch City Council had the Canterbury Development Corporation and now has Christchurch NZ among its arms. The method many countries and regions have used to change the structure of their economy, the industries that drive it and the role of government is what we call industry policy. It was how most of the high-income countries bootstrapped themselves out of agriculture. There are at least as many variations as there are countries, and perhaps even more than that. But to be done well, the government takes a strategic view of what it wants in the economy, wants the economy to be like, and is willing to get involved in changing the economic structure to achieve it. A strategic view means having a clear view of what you would like the future to look like, such as good jobs, high productivity, increased exports, environmental sustainability, and clear priorities to get there, what you will and you won't do, and encourage. Industry policy was intensely disliked by the neoliberal architects, and many economists and politicians still have that view. Opposition is rooted in the idea that the market knows best. But we know that the market, left to itself, will not only generate huge inequalities of income, wealth and power, it is likely to create an economy that perpetuates that situation I've described. Its vested interests work to keep it that way and have the resources to do that. The recent enthusiastic adoption of industry policy in many countries, including the United States, though with obvious differences between the Biden and Trump administrations, means that it's coming back as accepted practice. In fact, all governments have always done it, but often not very well. The current government is favouring the oil exploration industry with $200 million of investment, agriculture in many ways, including subsidising its methane emissions, the space industry and digital strategy. Nationally, we should adopt an industry policy approach too, but do it properly. The Productivity Commission, when I was there as a commissioner, laid out one type which it called focused innovation. with the primary aim of raising New Zealand's productivity. It involved attracting a large firm at the frontier of productivity and developing an ecosystem of smaller firms, supplying it and making use of its products in ways that spread the knowledge present in the firm and its workers to others. This would raise productivity and knowledge in many parts of the economy rather than leaving it concentrated in one firm. It was based on a study of how other small advanced countries, such as the Nordic countries, the Netherlands and Austria, have done it over many decades. Important features of all of their practices included that they took a strategic long-term approach, which was often maintained with some variations across changes in government. Often they had a high-level council, including people from business, unions, academia, and we would add Māori, who have the added value of often bringing a long-term view, and chaired by the Prime Minister or another senior minister, and that oversaw the strategy and regularly checked on its progress. At the industry level, businesses, unions, Māori and officials are given freedom to decide how to achieve change consistent with the government strategy. We don't necessarily have to take the large firm or industry-based approach. There are other ways to do it. One that has great promises put forward by the UK-Italian economist Mariana Mazzucato, which she calls mission-based. The government or city puts forward an objective that is needed for its community. It could be developed in a community-based process or in the normal consultation or political process. Then the government sets up a project which it supports to achieve that objective. It may involve research and experimentation and inviting ideas for new ways of doing it. All of that develops the capabilities of workers and firms. I'm in no position to comment on what the City Council's agency, Christchurch NZ, is doing, but I see it setting out strategies for the city and actions to achieve the objectives of the strategies. The methods used at a regional or city level need not be the same as a national strategy, but many of the principles need to be the same. A strategic and long-term view, a process that engages with the whole community so that they feel ownership of the process, and a strategy is given the best chance to survive changes in councillors and mayors from election to election. Participation, which draws on the knowledge that all of those involved can bring to the process, whether they be business leaders, unions and workers in those businesses, and the HPHE that Mark was talking about is an example of how that can be done. Local hapu and iwi, elected representatives, city officials, or experts such as from the universities and Ara Institute. People must be supported through the changes that development brings about. Much of that must be a national responsibility, but the city must be advocating for what is needed. It must focus and make choices, because a country the size of Aotearoa, let alone a city within it, cannot do everything. It must make the best use of the resources available to the city, including its educational, training, research and development institutions and capabilities, its geography and locality, and the physical resources in the region. And this is where the City Council's assets come in. It's worth reflecting on our history. In the development of Aotearoa since colonisation, government, whether central or regional, played a crucial and active role, developing industries and infrastructure. Road, rail, airlines, electricity, telecommunications, civil engineering and much more were carried out by the government until they were closed or privatised in the 1980s and 90s. They had created the basis for our development as an advanced economy. The history of Christchurch shows the same pattern. The City Council owned many of the assets needed for its development. We can and should be ready to do the same now, especially in the areas that are critical for our economy and society. It's remarkable to see Trump taking government shareholdings in large firms he views as critical. The California state government selling insulin to undercut the pharmaceutical companies, and Mamdani in New York proposing government-owned supermarket competition. The value of publicly owned assets is not only or even mainly the financial returns they bring. It is the usefulness of them to the community and to the development of the local economy. The excellent survey carried out by NZDE showed that is what the people of Christchurch think too. They want their council to own its operations and assets in order to improve their lives rather than simply make maximum profit. If the council-owned operations' principal objective is to operate as a successful business that has maximised profits, then their ability to create the greatest economic and community benefits is hampered. Indirect ownership through Christchurch City Holdings is another barrier, and Nath was just talking about that point. So what's the potential? Here's just some examples. Low-cost electricity makes for a healthier community, an attractive place to live, and an attractive place to set up a business. Christchurch owns its own lines company, Orion, but its commercial objectives and its limitation to owning the lines network gets in the way of using it to provide low-cost power. From what I hear, it does a good job within that straitjacket, but it could do so much more. The council used to own South Power when it was both a lines and a retail power company. It ran a commercial operation that kept down costs, but balanced commercial with social objectives. It did its best to ensure low-income people were not unduly disadvantaged and encouraged energy saving. There's an increasing movement for local power generation, which is possible using solar and wind power, and in some regions, geothermal. This would cut the city loose from reliance on the dominant price-gouging gentailers and open the door to lower prices. If the council fully owned its airport, then it would be easier to direct it to assist in aviation-based industries and producers for whom closeness to airport transport is a significant benefit. If it owns its own port, it can encourage development of industries near to it which need its facilities, and ensure that as far as possible it's providing the shipping routes that they need. In all three of these cases, it can make sure they're prepared for emergencies such as earthquakes and pandemics. If it builds and owns council houses, it provides work, puts downward pressure on rents, making Christchurch an attractive place to live, and ensures all Christchurch residents have their human right to healthy and warm housing. The city is unusual in owning its own fibre network infrastructure and enable services. It could use it not only to ensure residents have good internet access, but also increase its speed and capacity to encourage the development of digital-based industries and research institutions, and allow other industries such as advanced manufacturing to improve their technology and productivity. City Care gives you the ability to keep the maintenance and construction of the city's assets in-house, although I understand it's not actually doing that at the moment. That is important for many reasons. It provides good jobs, it relieves the city of the costs of expensive contract negotiations and tendering exercises, and paying for the profits of contractors. Just as importantly, it retains skills and expertise. These can provide the basis for in-house innovation, but they can also mean that if the city does contract out some projects or functions, it has the expertise to specify the contracts and oversee them to completion. Otherwise, the council loses its ability to effectively oversee the letting and performance of contracts. Wellington City scandalously experienced this loss recently when it found that its Three Waters operation, Wellington Water, had virtually handed over contracting of its activities to private contractors with little supervision. It had lost the ability to supervise them, and they were overpaid by $5 million or more. The council can, of course, go further and provide purpose-built facilities to attract particular industries to the city, and can help to bring together teams to work to assist their development. I probably don't need to add that a successful development strategy will encourage the development not only of other firms which provide goods and services to the new industries and use or market their products or services, but can also strengthen public facilities such as schools, polytechnics and universities. These institutions can be encouraged to provide courses that educate and train workers for the industries. They can provide research to speed up industry's development if there are effective coordination and liaison links between firms and researchers. City-owned assets can therefore be a powerful and key component of a development strategy, attracting high productivity, high-wage jobs and attracting newcomers to the city while taking care of your people and your environment. They maintain within the City Council the expertise needed for future developments, and for overseeing those operations it does decide to contract out. They're a key part of Christchurch being a good place to live. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. That was really valuable. There's so many good arguments there for maintaining control of public infrastructure. That was really good. Another hand for Bill Rosenberg. When you mentioned, this government's doing, I kind of thought the kind of attitude seems to be if you can't control it, then get rid of it. Mm-hmm. And of course, we've seen in Canterbury what happened before when they decided to get rid of a democratic elected regional council. Simply unceremoniously removed them, and as a result, we have very little swimmable waterways in Canterbury anymore because it's become a massive dairy farm. Thank you, Bill. Good reminder of the changes that we've seen and that they haven't been good. I remember Max Bradford, Minister for Energy, I think he was in 1990, saying, well, deregulating power is going to be the best thing for consumers. Right. Couldn't trust them then, can't trust them now. But thank you for those reminders. Really, really timely and relevant. Our final speaker for this evening, after which we will have a small break and then a Q&A session. So you can ask your burning questions then. But our final speaker is Mr. Craig Renney, who is economist currently for the CTU. He's spoken to us before, and he has a very relevant example from the UK with the Scottish National Investment Bank, and how building on what Bill's talked about with the kind of benefit we gain from having public assets controlled by public interests is and what can be done with infrastructure that is maintained in public control. And so I'd like to, a big round of applause and hand the time over to Mr. Craig Renney.
Thank you. Why retaining public asset matters. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Craig Renney. I'm the Economist and Director of Policy at the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions, Te Kawe Kaimahi. For absolute full disclosure, I'm also the candidate for Labour in Wellington Bays in 2026, just before anybody asks any questions. But everything I say here today is as the CTU economist. It wouldn't make any difference, to be frank, but just for absolute clarity, I'm speaking as the CTU economist here today. Now, it's going to get romantic all of a sudden. There you go. So first of all, can I thank the organisers of the event this evening, NZDE, for their help in getting me here, RMTU, as ever. It's a pleasure to work with you again. One of the benefits of coming last is that you get to agree with all of the speakers. In particular, can I agree with the policy of renationalising our energy owners, which is also helpfully CTU policy. The job of doing this is made immeasurably easier when you're prefaced by the economist and director of policy at the CTU who came before you, in Bill Rosenberg. So thank you, Bill, for your speech and for your contribution to this conversation, not just today, but over many years. I know you've held this conversation. Now, the ownership of public assets in New Zealand is an issue that matters deeply to our country. It's an issue that Christchurch understands, perhaps more so than any other city in Aotearoa. in the importance of public institutions and strong public institutions and resilient public infrastructure. You all know what it means when essential systems fail, and what it takes to rebuild them, because you've lived that. So today I want to talk to you about why retaining public assets is not just a matter for Wellington or for what happens in the Treasury or in distant boardrooms. It's a matter that affects every household, from Rangiora to Rolleston, from Littleton to the central city. And in my view, there are 5 reasons, and we'll go through them, why, but each of them has a particularly special significance for Christchurch. The first one of those is long-term income. We often hear this phrase: we sell some assets and we get some quick cash. We get a fast injection of money. You may have heard the phrase, we'll build a fund. Now, we've heard that in Wellington. I've heard that in Auckland. It's almost as if there's a bunch of consultants going around the country selling the same fund over and over. Oh, there are the same consultants going around the country selling the same fund. But here in Christchurch, you know in particular that quick fixes rarely solve long-term problems. After the earthquakes, we didn't rebuild by selling everything off. We rebuilt by investing in the infrastructure that would serve generations to come. One of the many reasons why the great city that I live in, Whanganuiatara, is quite so broke is because our water infrastructure makes very regular public appearances on the streets. Where Wellington is known as the Venice of the South Pacific, but not for reasons that you would otherwise think. Helpfully or unhelpfully, an earthquake or two has solved that problem in Christchurch, but as we did that by investing in our public infrastructure, not by selling it off. Now, when public assets are held in public hands, the income that they generate stays local. And for a region like Canterbury, this means more funding for the essential public services that you want to support. Selling these assets means losing that income forever in the hope that alternative investments generate a similar or better return. Now, let me give you an example of that in real life. Who was here in 2012 when Bill English decided to start selling off the electricity providers, and he invented a thing called, stay with me, the Future Investment Fund. And the Future Investment Fund was going to recycle those assets into other things that we thought were important. Schools, hospitals. And what do all those schools and hospitals not do? They don't generate an income. So we were selling income generating assets, and we were buying assets that will cost us money in the long run. Now, I know Bill English did his Masters in English Literature, not economics, and the current Finance Minister did her Masters in English Literature, but perhaps it's time we had somebody in there who could count. But in terms of that, we created a Future Investment Fund. $4.5 billion was generated at that time from those assets, and inside 4 years, that money had gone. Disappeared. Hands up if you're feeling the benefits of that electricity sell-off in your last power bill. Anyone? Do you feel back on track yet? So, the final question I've got for you there is, so when you sell these public assets, the profits don't vanish. They simply go to private shareholders, many of whom may live overseas. If they were such bad assets, then why are private investors so keen to own them every time we try and sell them? Cantabrians understand this, that we know that the best investments are the ones that keep paying you back year after year after year, as your public assets do. If they aren't working as you want, which is often the criticism that gets levelled at public assets, oh, they're lazy assets, they're not doing what we want. You know, we can do better. You know, we can take that money, we can invest it elsewhere. That's not an ownership problem, that's a management problem. If they're not working as you want, change the management. Don't change the ownership. You're just selling a thing so somebody else can manage them better than you and make a profit, and you lose twice. So that's issue number one. Issue number two is fair access for all communities. Christchurch is a city of very diverse communities, from the Port Hills to eastern suburbs, from expanding satellite towns to long-established neighbourhoods. Equitable access to essential services in this city is not a nice to have. It's crucial, and as Bill has talked about, it's crucial to economic development. It's crucial to new jobs being formed in the city. And we've seen across the country, not just in Christchurch, but across the country, what happens when communities are left behind. I spent much of last month in Tokoroa, which is not only seeing OG close, it's seeing Carter Holt Harvey close. It's going to lose about $90 million and about 400 jobs a year in wages. They're already losing their young people to Australia, and that workforce is taking their redundancy check and going to the Gold Coast, which makes keeping the assets in that city, in that town, harder and harder and harder. The public assets get more expensive to deliver when you close these things down. So private companies naturally focus on profit. That's not wrong. That's just how business works. Publicly owned companies allow us to focus on the delivery of services on issues such as equity and outcomes, not just shareholder value. And think here of the recently cancelled metro buses that exist. Now, we've seen about 12 of those buses closed, but many more buses are running to suburbs where the passenger volumes might not justify the current route on a purely commercial basis. Think of the projects like after the earthquake, the stabilisation of Lyttelton Port, which might not have happened if it was a purely profit-motivated exercise. And so what makes much of Christchurch livable would not simply exist if we relied upon a pure profitability measure. Public assets guarantee service, not just to the most profitable neighbourhoods, but to every neighbourhood. I was actually just chatting earlier about a French example where in France, the ownership of refuse is run at the arrondissement level, so the very, very street level. And the city of Lyon has 17 arrondissements. And about 5 of these are very wealthy. And about 10 of them are very poor, banlieue. And they don't exist coterminously. There's a lump over here and a lump over here and a lump over here. And the 5 arrondissements that are very wealthy, all of their refuse trucks work together. But it means you've got empty refuse trucks travelling through the city of Lyon to get to the wealthy area to pick up waste, to then drive to the other wealthy parts of the city to pick up their waste, and ignoring all the waste on the way through. Because the wealthy areas don't want to share the costs of running waste services. Here in Christchurch and across New Zealand, we solve that problem by making it public. And everyone benefits and everyone pays. And it's a much more sensible system. Now, the third aspect of this, when the IT works, is about keeping control. Christchurch knows the value of local control. As you've just said, you know what happens when a suite of local politicians are simply disappeared as a consequence. Decisions about land, building priorities, infrastructure, all require coordination across councils, communities and across government. Christchurch has witnessed firsthand the importance of having critical systems managed by institutions accountable to the local residents, to local people, not to distant investors. If we lose ownership of essential assets, we lose control of the decisions that directly affect the region of Canterbury. Water quality and management is just one. Electricity reliability. If you find yourself in other parts of the country, the electricity isn't quite as reliable as it is here in Christchurch. Particularly further south in Otago, where they've got thousands of dud electricity poles that still need replacing, and through Aurora. Port operations, telecommunications infrastructure, public transport design. Imagine trying to negotiate our future disaster recovery or climate resilience, because none of us is getting away from climate change anytime soon, with a multinational shareholder group whose primary interest is dividends, not community well-being. Public ownership ensures that, public ownership ensures that decisions affecting Canterbury are made in Canterbury's interests. You retain economic control at a level where it matters most. Now, number 4 of this, and I'm going to explain this to you, is resilience. And if any region understands resilience, it's yours. You know how much you rely upon robust infrastructure. And during times of crisis, whether those be earthquakes, floods, fires, or future climate changes, public ownership gives government and councils the ability to act decisively for the public good. Now, let me give you an example of that outside of Christchurch. I live in Wellington, and unfortunately, we had a boarding house called Loafers Lodge. There are 8 men who are dead as a consequence of our inability to get our act together and build sufficient housing and to regulate the quality of sufficient housing. That Loafers Lodge and the owners of that are currently up before the magistrate, before the court, so I could be slightly careful what I say in front of a camera. But they're up for manslaughter charges because there weren't the sprinklers, there weren't the fire doors. Those men didn't need to die if that property had been up to standard. When we run public assets properly, people don't die. And Loafers Lodge, which by the way is still an empty, fire-ridden shell in Newtown, is a living testament to the lack of public assets. We've stopped building Kainga Ora housing in Wellington. We have a council who is flat broke, and Te Toi Mahana is flat broke and it can't build the housing it needs to build. We have empty Kainga Ora housing across the city that can't be repaired because the government's pulled the funding. So we know what that means, and in resilience in the city, private firms will always prioritise short-term returns. And let me give you the example of the electricity market example of that. Every year before privatisation in 2012, investment in new plant and equipment and new generation, capital investment, exceeded dividends to the shareholder, which was the government. Every year since privatisation, dividends now exceed investment in electricity generation. We generate exactly the same amount of electricity as we did 10 years ago. 44,000 gigawatt hours. The population during that period of time has gone up by 1 million. GDP is 30% larger. Each one of you on a GDP per capita basis, on a per capita basis, is using 13% less electricity than you were 10 years ago. Despite the fact that we have a 10,000% increase in the number of electric cars. We use more electricity in our homes, more heat pumps. Everything from robot hoovers to air conditioning units are now much more common in our areas, to iPads, right? But we're all using less electricity. How's that the case? Because our electricity market is actively de-industrialising our economy. We're spending 70% less electricity in paper and pulp manufacturing, 50% less in chemicals, 30% less in steel. We are de-industrialising as a consequence of our lack of public ownership of those assets. And put simply, Christchurch needs markets that work for its local residents, not for those overseas shareholders. Now, finally, public assets are about protecting future Cantabrians, protecting future generations. Every Cantabrian knows the importance of thinking ahead, about always having a plan. Selling assets is easy, buying them back is costly, if not impossible. Rebuilding them, if we ever needed to buy them back, is often incredibly expensive, almost impossible. Many countries have learned this lesson incredibly painfully. And let me give you the example of where I'm from in the UK, Thames Water. Thames Water was privatised in 1992 by what I can only describe as the John Major government of the time. It's since taken billions and billions and billions of pounds of dividends for shareholders since privatisation. In the last 6 months alone, it made $1 billion New Zealand dollars in profit. It's now more than $35 billion New Zealand dollars in debt. Yet it regularly pumps raw sewage into the Thames and fails every environmental standard that exists. But that's okay, because after Brexit, We got rid of the environmental standards. You can't fail an environmental standard that doesn't exist. It now looks very likely that the government is going to be forced to renationalise Thames Water in a fire sale. And when it does, it will take over the liability for all of its debt. So we sold it for nothing. It gets to extract billions of dollars. It does the exact opposite of the job we asked it to, which is to provide clean water. And then we buy it back for $35 billion. How is that, how, in any country apart from the world, if you had described a fraud, I would go, yeah, exactly. So, future generations in Christchurch will face challenges we can't yet see. Technological, environmental, economic. The least we can do is to ensure they inherit a city and a country with strong, publicly owned systems that work for them. Put it more simply, some of our biggest firms in New Zealand, Air New Zealand, Zespri, Fonterra, Fletcher's, were all at some point in time either publicly owned or operated with a public purpose. Now they're making fortunes for private ends. Where we have Fonterra selling off its brands, its food brands, to a French conglomerate. A public company would have thought about the long run value of those. It would have thought about how the R&D that's being lost. It would have thought about how we as a country are going to pay our way in the future. It would have thought about the export losses. Instead, we're deindustrializing and we all lose as a consequence. That's not what stewardship means. Stewardship means owning assets gives you control over your future. It allows you to help manage economic change, as Bill quite rightly said, in ways that don't allow the costs of that change simply to fall on those with the least ability to pay. It means not becoming prey to it, and there's a pretentious term we use in economics, and I do apologise, called path dependency, where you end up with small industries. You become reliant upon those industries, which means you invest in those industries, which means you have to have those industries. You can't invest elsewhere. You can't do other things. In New Zealand, we've become path dependent on milk and dairy products. We've become path dependent upon timber and horticulture, agriculture. We've become path dependent upon selling, at the moment, beef to the US, which just can't get enough of our beef. We were path dependent upon tourists until COVID. But where's the advanced manufacturing? Where's the service jobs? Where's the financial services jobs? Where's the pharmaceutical jobs? Where's the other jobs? The jobs that we can lift the country's productivity with. We had a fella, I don't know if you saw the article the other day, we had a fella on the TV telling us that our main problem was that we took too long off over Christmas. And Christopher Luxon was on the radio this morning saying, there's something to this and we need to look at it. We, as a country, we spend too long off at Christmas. It's affecting our productivity. It's affecting who we are as a country. We have low productivity because we have industries. We rely upon industries that don't respond to productivity change. We have low productivity because we don't invest in our country. Jacinda said, be kind. And so the timer. So that's what stewardship means. Why does this matter for Christchurch? This matters for Christchurch because after 2011, public institutions restored the city, not private investors. They acted based upon need, not upon profits. So retaining public assets is not only economically smart, it's morally right. Retaining control isn't a burden, it's a privilege to make sure we're building a better economy for our kids. Public assets give you the tools and the ability to build the Christchurch that you want, a city that's more equitable, a city that's sustainable, a city that's more resilient, a city that works for everyone, not just for shareholders. Because public assets are not just simply the things that we own. They are expressions of who we are as a country, who we are as New Zealanders. Every investment we make is a choice, and our choice illustrates our values. Don't fall prey to the same mistake we did in the UK with local authorities, where we sold everything. And now we own nothing, and we have exactly the same problems, only we have no levers of being able to address it. So if you want a fairer, more resilient Aotearoa, then owning public assets is not just the right choice, but particularly for Christchurch, it's the only choice that should be available to us. Thank you all so much for listening.
I love the perspective. Your perspective is just so grounding, and the whole idea, when you sell something to get some quick cash, how are you then going to pay for the things that you need to pay for that was paying for? It's a basic question, but it's a really relevant question, and one that every New Zealander, not only Cantabrian, should be asking the upcoming election next year. Well, thank you very much, Craig Renney, and another round of applause, please. And for all of those who have spoken to us this evening, thank you so much for your contribution. Round of applause for all of our speakers tonight. We now have just a 5-minute break while we set up some minor infrastructure on the stage for our Q&A, which will be coming very shortly. But if you wanted to take a wee break, stretch your legs, stretch, I said, then we'll come back for the Q&A session directly after that. Thank you. Just before we start that Q&A session, if you haven't written your name on the attendance sheet, please do so now, and don't forget that at the conclusion of this, I'll just round up, and the whole purpose of this evening is to build momentum for the things that we've been talking about tonight. So watch the socials, there will be another meeting coming up in the new year. So without further ado, Bill Rosenberg and Mark Wilson, and also we have Dick Werry and Craig Renney to answer any questions you may have. We've got about 15 minutes for this, so we won't keep you that much longer, but I think you can all agree that we've had a very interesting evening. So any questions?
I do. I've got a loud voice. So you just talked about building momentum, which is great. That works. Talk about building momentum. No. So what is the next step then? You know, what can we in this room do? We presumably all agree with the points you've been making. So what are we going to do next?
Good question. So the question is, what are we going to do next in order to build momentum around this?
Vote Labour.
Well, I was going to say, can I make a recommendation to you about 2 ticks? But in all seriousness, we've managed to see off threats to Port Littleton Port over and over again. We've seen off threats at Wellington Airport to be for the last of the shares to be sold. At Ports of Auckland, we saw off the threat there. It's a constant job of vigilance to stop those threats. But then it's also about building the social license for how do we bring more assets back into public ownership? How do we demonstrate the values that we want to see? And that, unfortunately, means a couple of things. One, it means electing governments that share similar values, and electing people who share similar values to you about owning public assets, about solving those problems and not privatising those assets. And 2 is constantly pushing back every time we keep being told there is no alternative. Because there is an alternative. The millisecond someone tells you that something has to be done that way, that's a statement of faith rather than a statement of truth in economics. And so our job is unfortunately to constantly do that so that others behind us can then keep that fight going, because there's always going to be this tension, and our job is to help do that. But we're in a good place right now. But if there is a the National Party has already said that if it's re-elected in 2026, it will be re-examining public assets for ownership. The Treasury has already been instructed to go through all of the public assets and earmark those it would like to see brought forward for privatisation. So without turning this into a party political broadcast, there are some really simple choices available to us. And if we want to protect those assets, we've got a job of work to do in the about 340 days we have until the next election.
But I just think we have to go beyond party politics, surely. You know, even within the other parties, there are people within those parties that would agree with a lot of what has been said tonight. So how do we capitalise on that and bring it all together so it sits outside of politics? That's what I think needs to happen.
Yes, look, I think you're quite right there. Both the Clark government and the Ardern government were very faithful caretakers of the neoliberal movement, and that they took no action in spite of to fight against it, and they took very little, apart from a handful of things. I mean, the fair pay agreements was a very big step forward, but apart from that, they really managed the economy on the basis of taking care of what had been undertaken by the neoliberal movement. What I think we do have to have a government that's going to seek, to develop a very significant industrial policy. Those industrial policies should include regaining public assets where it's possible and growing into new ones. Now, I think First Union was the one that was responsible for the huge amount of research that was done on the Green Ministry of Works. It's literally a no-brainer that we should have a Ministry of Works that could easily can save huge amounts of money, can build a housing infrastructure, and manage things like railway. It should always be done with own forces, and enhance the public ownership. So anyway, there we are.
I'll just speak very quickly. Just at a local level, because obviously we're talking a little bit nationally, at a local level, obviously, we've talked about how Christchurch retains ownership of its public infrastructure, and we were successful. A lot of people here were successful in mobilising voters in the local election. However, what stood out for me was that it was amazing how many voters we were just relying on them to turn up and vote, and a lot of those people are getting older. So what I would say to you is that we really need to be looking at encouraging and educating the younger people at how important it is for this public infrastructure. Maybe it's public transport, maybe it's other things that are a bit more tangible for them. That's what I would really focus on that. And also, from a union perspective, we're going to be holding the boards accountable, and potentially we might be trying to do that through a council process. When we do that, we'd certainly like the support of Christchurch to be in behind us, because obviously we're fighting for conditions, but behind the scenes, we're fighting for public ownership and control of our ports.
At the risk of repeating some of what my wise colleagues here have said, when you vote to get a more sympathetic government, and that's only a first step. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt said to people who came in to ask him to do something, he said to them, "Yeah, I agree with that. Now go out and make me do it." And that's actually the key, because whoever gets into power, they will be under constant pressure possibly from Treasury, but from endless streams of vested interests knocking constantly at their doors. Anyone who thinks they can make some money out of privatisation and contracting out will be knocking on that door and either promising making promises they can't keep or threatening. And so the pressures are just endless. They're not just at election time, though. They just go on and on. And so we have to provide that counterweight. We have to be saying constantly, that's not what the people want. Those are stupid decisions. We don't bound to those vested interests. Go the way that we know is right.
Those are good answers. And I'd just say, like, as a Labour Party member myself, full disclosure, the people in New Zealand need good choices, right? And so they need parties to vote for who are openly, actively and transparently calling out neoliberalism and saying they will do things differently. I like what was said before about that you said, Dick, that, you know, when Labour was last in government, particularly under the good Harry, particularly, you know, during the Clark administration, you know, instead of actively, and, you know, Labour had an absolute majority under MMP, right? They could have taken steps to completely undermine that system, but were too afraid to. Need to act with courage, and New Zealanders need to hear that message and demand it. But we've heard demand it of our politicians to act with courage rather than cowardice, bending to corporate interests. Yep. Do we have any more questions over here?
Yeah, so many things that I want to ask you about, but I suppose from what you've just said, I mean, you mentioned BlackRock and these, you know, multinational venture capitalists, you know, hedge fund managers, and actually those are the sort of forces that we're up against.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
You know, this is not like a local issue as such. You know, it's symptomatic of you know, the globalization of, you know, of imperialism, of which New Zealand is a active member. So actually, you need to take a stand against those people too. And I'm not sure that any national party, by which I mean a political party operating at that level, has the balls to do that. To be quite honest.
Yeah. Yep.
So
good question.
We need a new party. Is electoralism even the way to go with this? My argument would be probably not. I have no faith that Labour will stand up to the international powers that be, because they ultimately are part of this political system that is pulling the strings that bind us all. So, not really a question, but
I think that
I understand. Yeah.
I think that we need to get probably a little bit more serious and hardcore than just voting.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I'm already reminded of, I think it's Warren Buffett's famous quote, that in the next life, he didn't want to come back as a wealthy man, he wanted to come back as the bond market. When he was asked why that's the case, he said, everyone's frightened of the bond market, right? And and so at a national level, you know, that's one thing. The challenge here is that many of the most insidious forms of privatisation are going to take place at local authority level or a regional council level.
What regional council?
You know, well, the one that we, you know, until we have the amalgamation of local authority groups. Brief diversion. I used to work for a rather grandly titled Association of North Eastern Councils in the UK. It was the forerunner to the regional assemblies that never went anywhere. And ANEC was 26 local mayors all meeting in the same room to make regional decisions. I worked for them for 3 years and we made no decisions at all, full stop. Because there was 26 degrees of hatred going on from every single mayor hating every single other mayor and thinking every single other mayor was trying to screw each and every other one. And that's what you will find in these new regional amalgamations. I think, and the challenge there at a local level is to say, how do we push back against those forms? And in Wellington, we did that quite successfully with the airport because the council was convinced that it could take the money that it was going to get from the shares, invest it with BlackRock or State Street or somebody else for free. there were no costs, that this was fine. As if, that you were going to they were still going to have control and, importantly, liquidity over that cash. That this money was going to be ethically invested. That this money was going to be ethically invested in things in Wellington. All of which is bananas.
Yeah.
Right? So, we have a constant job work to do. At the national level, it's a different story. But at the local level and at the regional level, there will need to be a constant pushback against this, because at a national level, you don't think you have any power. At a local and regional level, you absolutely have no power. You are a price taker from those sorts of organisations. And that's something we're going to have to constantly watch against. And that's not a party political point. That's actually an administrative point. Because councils of all political types are going to get lured into that notion that if they sell public assets, put the money in other things, they'll be able to keep rates low, they'll be able to deliver services, and all the evidence from history tells us that's not the case.
Yeah, we should be. We should rightly be concerned, right? We're familiar with Nazi Germany and the Japanese in World War II. Well, the reason that though the leaders of those nations rose to power was because of the deals they either had done or had been done to them by other nations, which led their people to becoming impoverished. And as a result, it just took one charismatic leader to say, oh, I will change that around. We've seen that in the United States, right, with Donald Trump. I'm the answer to make us great again. It's all it takes, right? And you get some very scary outcomes. And we don't want to go down the road where that's where we end up. But that's where you end up. In the United Kingdom at the moment, you're seeing riots in the streets, right? But they've been caused ultimately by going down the same track. It always ends the same way. And we don't want that for New Zealand. And so we have to talk to our friends, our families, social media. If any chance we get to get into the media, one of the things I was very excited about NZDE over this Littleton thing was we managed to get some good newspaper coverage of that issue, and we put it on the agenda for the local body elections in a way that it didn't really come up in other places in New Zealand to the same extent. And that's just because of a few people being willing to exercise their voice and some meetings like this to get that word out. So sometimes you look at it and it seems impossible, but sometimes you can. All it takes is to get over that middle line, and then it grows momentum by itself. And so often we don't need to do a lot to achieve that. Well, hands everywhere. We're actually out of time. One more question, but who's going to get that question? Who's got the biggest voice? Throw it out. Throw it out. Someone.
All right. The man with the orange. Here we go. Oh, okay, there's that point and that point. I've been involved in three. My name's Murray Horton, campaigning against foreign control out here. I've also convened to keep our assets. And so Bill and I have been involved in campaigns to keep assets in Christchurch.
Yes.
I've been through specifically to address your point. 20 years ago, an attempt by a Labour council to sell a little port company to a Hong Kong transnational corporation, defeated grassroots and photovoltaic. 10 years ago, the Darrell Council tried to sell City Care to a French water transnational, Veolia, defeated by a grassroots campaign and the council's own funds. Right. This year, this council rumoured to be trying to sell the water Renewal to Dubai Post, DP Wood. They've gone. I'm told that their office has moved out of Christchurch. So the question about voting, and electoralism, so what can we do? So what we did to keep our assets, we sent a pledge to every candidate and said, sign this, saying, I won't sell assets.
Yes.
That stage where they're sitting in September was full of candidates holding up their certificates, all smiling. I've got a photograph.
Yep.
And a lot of them were very young,
Yes.
not old dollars. They were holding up candidates for community board, I won't sell assets. They got voted in a lot of them. It was an eternal battle front page lead story today's press. Get the press.
Yep.
Front page lead story today's press. We must sell asset. Front page lead story. And they 5 before that. Why? It's the government said they're going to bring in the 2 to 4% rates cap. And one of the councillors quoted on the front page of today's press, Councillor Tim Scandrett.
Cheers.
I'm open to thinking about it. He signed our pledge.
Right.
I won't sell assets. So it needs to be worked on. But Mark and I know that public pressure works very well for these guys. To the end of 2023, Christchurch City Holdings Limited, a holding company that operates 6 of the commercial companies for the council worth about $5 billion, they tried to pull a move at 24 hours notice for them to be given the authority to actively run the assets as opposed to simply administer 24 hours. The council vote for us and we'll run as we see fit by yourself. So Mark and the maritime unions and our guys, we mobilised a crowd that filled the debating chamber of the Christchurch City Council building and faced them down. And as repeated in the front page of today's press, they voted 8-7 not to go down that route. With the intense disappointment of the capitalist class of Christchurch and the Christchurch Press newspaper, they voted 8-7 not to proceed at 24 hours notice. At the beginning of this year, Kawa Keep Our Assets, we had a delegation to go and see the mayor and a delegation to go and see the chair of Christchurch City Holdings Limited. We said to the mayor, why do you agree to steps? And he quoted in reply, because if we don't, every 3 years you guys put a rocket at us. Okay, that's what Call Me Phil Major said to us.
Right. Yeah.
And just to finish, I mean, the point I personally made to both those CEO of CCHL and the mayor was, we need to think about assets in the same way as the biggest public asset in Christchurch. And they said, what are you talking about? And I said, think about it. What is the physically biggest public and oldest asset in Christchurch? And they said, what are you talking about? And I said, Hadley Park. I said, the whispery old bloody top-hatted chauvinists who founded that 180 years ago had no idea what they were bequeathing to the city, but that is the biggest public asset, so big that everybody just takes it as part of the furniture. On every metric, including money, the Electric Avenue bloody festival is going to bring 90,000 people into Christchurch, apparently, and I'll hear every bit of it where I live at. Right? I mean, so in every metric, that is the most successful public asset in the city, and it's just taken for granted. So we need, and we said to the mayor, he said, look, it's pretty, what the fuck are you talking about? You know, because it's so much taken as part of the furniture. So there is our approach. At the local level, I mean, the central government keeps trying to push. I mean, forcing local governments, regional councils to sell these things at the local level, because Christchurch people have fought back and not rolled over and died, unlike in other parts of the country. We have kept our assets, right? But it's a constant battle.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Last question.
It seems to me that there's 2 pathways. One is you try and reform capitalism and you make it more humane, a bit more socialist, you keep public assets. And that's the track this country has been on since the start.
Yep.
The only effective challenge to that was the Māori iwi, who had another system. And they didn't want this system. They wanted another system.
Yes.
They wanted to evolve this country in another way. Now, in 1882, King Tāwhiao, magistrate at Pirongia, laid down 500 muskets because he knew that they were outnumbered, they were outgunned. No system change here.
Yep.
Okay, now we're in a whole other stage of capitalism at this point, and it is global, and it's extremely fragile, and it's extremely predatory and dangerous.
Yes.
The question comes, are we going to just keep on this track of reform capitalism, make it a little bit better, a little bit more humane, or are there people in this country who are serious about transitioning to a much better system?
Yes.
And that hasn't really been addressed here. I respect and thank every speaker, including Murray's final comments there, because that is so important, but there's this other part, and that's the change of system. Any comments?
I've spoken a lot. So.
Okay. Look, I mean, for me and for our union, we're focused on what's winnable at the moment. And so for us, you know, we're not entering into a complete change of the system. We're trying to work within it and ensure that transparency is the main vehicle for change, because there are policies, there are good rules in place that if our elected officials actually followed them, we would be in a better place. It's just difficult for everyone to follow what is in place, and maybe it needs to be updated or changed. But that's what we're going to be looking to hold the council and maybe even, government, to the laws that they pass, and ensure that they implement them correctly in the best interests of the people.
No, I sort of hear where you're coming from, and I'm reminded of Lenin's comment that we should support the Social Democrats like a rope supports a hanged man, which is not very opposite at the moment, I suppose. But dealing with your question about another party, I think the prospect of a Labour-Green alliance could actually be quite transformative, especially with Te Pāti Māori involved in that. And you remember the Jim Anderton's party was responsible for the creation of a bank. I think the main contribution, he tried to do a hell of a lot more than that, but he did at least get a nationally owned bank, however small and piddling it is. But it had at the time promise of much greater things.
Paid parental leave out of that as well.
Yeah, I'm reminded of, that's right, yes. I'm reminded, in 1962, there was a visit from some Soviet researchers to New Zealand. The extent of New Zealand public ownership then was huge. They expressed envy and said, we would love to achieve the degree of state ownership that you have achieved in New Zealand. We would love to achieve your progressive taxation that we can't. Neither of those things are possible within the Soviet Union. So I sort of get a bit befuddled by a left and right demarcation over these things. Anyway, that's my bit. I don't know.
Thank you for your contributions. And I want to, sorry we won't take any more questions, but I did want to just address that because, and really in some closing remarks, I just finished reading a book recently called Rebel in Arms by Kenneth Roberts. It was written in the 1930s in the United States. I don't know if anyone here has read it. I thought it was fantastic. But anyway, the thing that was really interesting about, and the part I want to talk about, is it focuses on the Revolutionary War, and a couple of American soldiers are taken by sock scouts who are kind of Western First Nations people from Canada, and they're taken back there, and of course they've got their attitudes towards Native Americans and all this kind of thing. And the sock people were just deciding at that time whether to support the British and the Canadians effectively, or the Americans against them. And they decided they were going to support the British. And the reason why is because they had found out what the Americans were like to their Indigenous people. And they said, we don't want any part of supporting them. They knew that the British weren't a great deal better, but they weren't that bad. And the chief gives this speech, which I just love, and I want to kind of close with that. He said, I don't understand the white Western system, because in our way of thinking, if there is somebody who is hungry, we feed them. If there is someone who needs somewhere to live, we provide them with a place to stay. If there's someone who is sick, we support them. If there is somebody who needs something to do, we give them a job. And it was so basic, but so poignant, because after all, that is what government is supposed to do for all of us, because we're a part of that. That is what democracy was supposed to provide. Those basic things, those human needs. But now we're fighting about the sale of water that we need to survive. You know, electricity that in a cold island like the South Island, we need to survive. And I think, you know, your question is absolutely relevant. I thank you for introducing it at the end. I believe that Indigenous systems all over the world take care of these things when, you know, capitalism has distanced the systems that should govern adequately from the people it needs to provide for. And so thank you for your question. But that's really what we've been talking about tonight. And I want to thank Craig Renney, and I want to thank Bill Rosenberg and Mark Wilson and Dick, yes, and also you, Dick Werry, so much for your contribution and for your book, for all of you reminding us that we don't need to be passive recipients of the crap that is dished out by a neoliberal system, or however it's rebranded by tinkering with the edges. We need a revolution. That revolution doesn't need to be bloody, but we need to be engaged and involved enough to say we want it different and demand that change. And in whatever way we are able to do that, I would encourage everyone here tonight to do that. Thank you all for your attendance. Thanks for coming, and thanks for being a part of it. Until next time, Merry Christmas.